Welcome. I'm Dr. Jackie Murray, and today we're going to be looking at Homer's Iliad. We will look at books 1 and book 9 in this episode, and then in the next episode, we'll look at two other books. So the outline of this video discussion will be, first, we're going to look at what is Greek epic poetry, what is a Homeric epic poetry. Then we'll move on to thinking about the ancient Greek context for experiencing this kind of poetry, and then we'll spend the rest of the lecture doing some close readings of the Iliad, books 1 and book 9, and we're going to focus specifically on the first word of the poem and how it resonates in these two books of the Iliad. Let's locate Greece on the map, because not everyone might be aware of where it is. So Greece, as we can see, is in the center of the Mediterranean. It's to the east of Italy and Sicily, which are here. It is to the west of Turkey, which is here. And it is to the north of North Africa, which is down here off the map. Now, in the Archaic period, when the Homeric poems start to become spread all over the Greek-speaking world, the city-states develop a sort of vision of themselves as having a common identity with other city-states where the language is in common and their gods are in common. And we call this process Panhellenization. And so the Homeric poems become central to this process of Panhellenization, in that people start to know about them and they start to be performed at various cult sites. In fact, on the island of Delos, which is not pictured here, but it's in the center of the Cyclades, uh, the Greeks that were in what we call Ionia, so the western coast of Turkey, would all gather on Delos for the festival called the Delia, where they would celebrate Apollo's birth, because Delos is the island where Apollo was born. And we're told by the historian Thucydides that it is there that Homer first performed the Homeric poems in this festival to Apollo. And so the Homeric hymn to Apollo, which is another text in our that survives, the Homeric poem to Apollo was the hymn that began the performance, and then the epic poems would follow. So what is epic poetry? Well, we can give this definition: a long poem composed in hexameter verses about the age of heroes. And this will work. However, it doesn't really tell us too much about what is going on with epic poetry. One way to get at it is actually to look at what the poems themselves say that they are. And thankfully, in the Odyssey, we do have pictures of bards, the guys who performed or composed these poems, and the narrator tells us what they're doing. So we have this what we call a mise en abîme, regression into infinity of the bard depicting other bards performing the same kind of poetry he is. And so we can look at that as one way of figuring out what is this kind of poetry that we're calling epic poetry. So the Odyssey, as I said, gives us these pictures. And we have two bards in the Odyssey. One is Phemius and one is Demodocus. And we're told that Phemius, he is the son of another bard, and he ends up working for Odysseus in his palace. Whereas Demodocus, we're told that he is actually taught by the Muses and is working in the palace of the Phaeacians, these mythical people who Odysseus encounters on his wanderings. All right, so when Phemius performs, the narrator tells us that he is singing about the disastrous returns of the Achaeans from Troy that Pallas Athena ordained. So these are the songs he is singing. And the songs, that kind of song is what we call a nostos, a return song, a song about the voyage back from some distant place, usually a sea voyage, given that the Mediterranean was the main way of getting around was by sea. So nostoi then are one form of epic song where we're singing about sea voyages, usually returning from a quest, or in this case, the war. Now, Demodocus, he sings a series of songs, including he sings about the quarrel between Odysseus and Agamemnon, or Achilles and Odysseus. He sings about the building of the horse, and his songs are identified by the narrator as the song-worthy deeds of hero men, Clea and Ron Heroon. And the content of his songs are the doom of the Achaeans and all they accomplished, and the sufferings and their struggles. So this gives us a sense that one aspect of epic is that they're not happy songs. There are songs about disaster. There are songs about struggling. There are songs about death. And in fact, there's one theory that these songs are actually funeral songs exaggerated into full-on stories about the dead hero. And we sing that in remembrance of the hero at his tomb or at the cult of the god associated with him. It's worth noting that in the concept of heroes from the ancient Greek world is that there's always a sort of divine antagonism toward the hero. So there is a god or set of gods who want to punish, destroy, obliterate the hero, and not unjustified, because the hero tends to be the kind of figure who does things that incurs the wrath of the gods, mainly because they are themselves half god and are breaking the boundaries of human and divine. And so because they're sort of not staying in their human place, but they're sort of transgressing into the divine sphere in their behaviors, in their actions, then the gods try to reinforce that divide. And usually they do that by showing their overwhelming power and through their devastating actions on the human community. So this is the stories then that ancient Greek epic entailed, how the gods reinforce their status as gods toward the humans by wiping out this intermediary group of heroes, the half gods, the demigods. So Clea and Roon Heroon then are stories that are about the destruction of the heroes, and there are specific tales then that emerge in this milieu from various groups of bards, and they usually involve the sacking of cities. The two major cities that get sacked are Troy and Thebes. They can also be about hunting adventures, slaying of monsters. You can think of Hercules, epics about Hercules were circulating, where he killed the various monsters like the Erymanthian boar, or the Hydra, the lion, etc. And the one particular tale that's told to us in Book 9 is the Caledonian War Hunt, which involved a collective of heroes who were trying to take down this boar that was ravaging the countryside, sent to ravage the countryside by the angry goddess Artemis because she had been offended by heroes. And of course, dangerous sea voyages. We mentioned the Nostoi, the return from Troy. A lot of the heroes were destroyed in storms and other kinds of disasters as they were returning because, of course, they had offended the gods. A great example is Ajax, who had raped Cassandra, and while he was taking away the Palladion, the statue of Athena, and Athena, of course, destroys him on the sea. But also, it can also be a quest myth. So the Argonauts, for example, their voyage, dangerous sea voyage, is to go and get the golden fleece. And so that also fits into the epic narrative. Okay, so what then is Homeric epic? Well, it's first important to stress that the epics were not written down, they were orally composed in performance. And so there are songs that develop about the various themes that I just mentioned, and various poets or bards coalesce around telling certain tales of the epic repertoire, the mythological repertoire. And so the idea is that then there are a group of bards who sing about the fall of Troy and who attribute their stories to their sort of mythical founder or father of their group, Homer. Now, some people think that Homer is a real person. However, as far as we can tell in antiquity, though they talk about Homer as if he were a person, even the most rational people, like say Aristotle, who refer to who was Homer, tell us that Homer was the son of some river god or the muse, etc. So he's clearly a mythological figure that is the father of a specific, perceived as the father of a specific repertoire of songs, and his sons, that is the Homeridae, the sons of Homer, they are working on these songs and distributing them in oral performance around the Mediterranean during the Archaic period. So in antiquity, then, a lot of songs get under the label of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, but also the Homeric hymns, the hymns that were performed with the Iliad, the Odyssey in these festival contexts, and even some parodic stories like the Battle of the Frogs and Mice and other poems like that. They get attributed to Homer, and most likely because they come out of this Homeridae group. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey, though, are what we in the modern world are willing to attribute to Homer, just because we don't trust that this is the case, because everything was under Homer. So the ones we want to give to Homer are the Iliad and the Odyssey, mainly because they emerge as truly magnificent works, and they become the center of how the ancient Greeks identify themselves. It becomes a sort of cultural heritage, and also the center of their education system. One might suggest that the Iliad and the Odyssey actually survive and are perpetuated, the Trojan War stories perpetuated because of the special attention that certain political entities in the ancient world give to it. The first being Athens, which attributed, which made it the center of its Panhellenic festival, and then later the Romans. You have to think about the Romans who insert themselves into the story, claiming that they are the Trojans. And so the Trojan War story emerges because, in part, of the ways in which it serves the political ideologies of these two important ancient states in the past. So now let's move on to talking about the actual context in which ancient people in the archaic period, before there's an actual text circulating, in the archaic period, how did they experience the poems? Well, first we need to think about the myth of the Trojan War, the sort of general story about the Trojan War, and how every city-state claimed that their hero, their local hero, participated in the fall of Troy. So that being the case, then at the local level, there's going to be stories told about the local hero and what his role was in the larger story. And it's not necessarily the case that they agree on how that hero performed in the next village. Right? In the next village or the next city state, that hero might not even appear in the story, or may have been doing something opposite of what he was doing in the city state he came from. So there's going to be conflicting versions of the myth depending at the local level. Now, what's happening in the archaic period is the movement to having a sort of recognizing that Greeks share common gods and a somewhat interintelligible language, and so they should come together and meet at various festivals for the gods at particular times of the year. And people will send their delegations to sing their local songs at these festivals and win prizes. It starts to become evident that you can't just sing your local song where, say, for example, your hero kills Achilles, or your hero is the one that killed Hector. That can't go, doesn't go over very well. So there becomes a way in which the local versions of myths get suppressed, and a more sort of vanilla version of the myth emerges in these Panhellenic contexts, a version that everybody can be happy with, or maybe it's a chocolate version. Anyway, the point is that it's a version of the myth that everybody's going to be basically okay with, instead of really controversial versions. And so it's in this period then that the poems start to congeal. So certain versions of stories start to become the standard version. So we know, for example, that the Cyclops episode of the Odyssey was already sort of fixed in that period, mainly because we have images of Odysseus and his men poking the Cyclops' eye out on vase paintings, etc. So this is starting to happen in that period. Now, another really important point is that the whole overarching story about the fall of Troy was never really experienced by anyone at all. They would experience episodes, and as I said, at the local level, there would be their local episode version of the episode, and then at the Panhellenic festivals, maybe a tailored version. But people rarely, or never, I would say, experienced the whole story from beginning to end in any one sort of sitting or experience. And remember, there's no text circulating, so there, there's no way to oversee the whole story in this period. Like, we know Troy fell. We know the Cyclops got his eye poked out. We know that Hector died. We know all these different episodes, but the idea of the whole story being one consistent whole from beginning to end, that is never experienced in for the audience. Maybe the bards who are putting it together may have thought about it, but certainly not the audience. Now, in the classical period, so the end of the archaic period, around the 6th century, moving into the 4th century, 3rd century, the poems start to take on a sort of authoritative shape. And the evidence we have for that is that Athens becomes a dominant city in the Mediterranean, in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean after the Persian Wars, but it's also on the rise anyway. And they take on the Trojan War story as their epic. They're going to take it on because Athena has a prominent role, or maybe they've given her a prominent role in the Trojan War story, and they decide that they're going to make that epic theirs. Now, it's one thing for you to take the story and take episodes and bring it together, but it's a whole other thing to actually do what the Athenians end up doing. So in the 6th century, we know that the tyrant Pisistratus and his sons, they reorganize the Athenian festival to celebrate Athena, and they make it into a more splendid, more inviting for everyone, making it they make it a Panhellenic festival. So there are already established Panhellenic sites, Delphi, Delos, Olympia, where people would already come, and as from way deep in the archaic period, this was Athens was not a center for Panhellenic festivals. Moreover, Athens really doesn't have any mythological claim to the Trojan War. And we know this because none of their heroes actually participated in that. Now, certainly in the text that we have, there's one line in the catalog of ships where Theseus brought ships to Troy. Well, even in antiquity, that was suspected as an insertion by the Athenians to sort of attach themselves to the Trojan War story. So they don't really have a claim to this, but their goddess is very prominent. So they're going to make this text theirs because of Athena's role. And so what happens is then Plato gives us this evidence that the son of Pisistratus, Hipparchus, was the first to bring to Athens the texts of Homer. And that is all of the Trojan War stories, right? And he forced the rhapsodes to perform them in order at the Panathenea by relay. So one bard would start, say, book 1 and maybe get through book 2, or we have what we consider book 1 and book 2, and then the next bard would pick up, etc. Now, this was not the way the epics were performed before. People would just perform an episode there. So it would appear then that what happens is there's all these stories about the Trojan Wars that the Homeridae have, and they're told to bring, maybe they're written down, and they're told to bring them, or the sort of sketch outline is written down, they're told to bring them to Athens and then work on making it that the texts actually follow logically one story episode to the next, etc. And so this is how the text actually gets its coherent structure. And in the Iliad, you can see some of the themes to this, because in some places people die twice, like they die in book 4 or something, and then showing up, the same guy ends up dying again. So there's a lot of, you could tell that this is being stitched together from a bunch of different stories or episodes, but not perfectly aligning with each other. But this is how our text comes to us. So this is important to think about. If the original audience it was never intended for the original audience to ever hear the whole thing, right? And even when we look at the Iliad, we're just getting a slice of this much larger story, right? We're just getting these 10 days at in the Battle of Troy where Hector is killed. That's all we're getting here in the 10th year of the war. We're not getting the whole war, all the episodes that could happen. We're not getting any of that. So even in what we have, we can tell that no one is ever expected to hear or experience the whole story. They sort of had bits and pieces, but not the whole story. And so that being the case, we have to think about when we have to think about interpreting the text in a completely different way than we are used to. Because when we approach text, we have the text in front of us, and that's how the text, if it was a modern text, that's how it was produced. It was produced as text to be read and interpreted as text by the audience. This was not the case with these epics. These epics were created in performance. They're stories that are told orally to a specific group, and there's no assumption that that group will hear the other version of the story being told on another island somewhere, or that the story they'll actually hear the whole story from beginning to end. So how do we approach that kind of text? This brings me to my caveat about how should we talk about Homer. How should you, as students, talk about Homer in any essays that you'll have to write? Homer, the whole idea of Homer as a person, and the idea of when the text became a fixed text that we have, that looks exactly like what we have, is the most controversial thing in the classics. Most of the learned scholars who have been working on this question cannot agree about any aspect of this. I shouldn't say any aspect. They all agree that the poems were orally composed. They all agree that at some point the text was written down and started to circulate as text. And they all agree that ancient scholarship then evolved around it. After that, there's not much agreement. So the main question is, when does the text that we have come into being? Was there an actual whole poem at the beginning of the Archaic period that looked a lot like our Iliad? And was that a text, a physical text? So there's a lot of controversy about that, a lot of theories, a lot to be read about that. So as a student, it is safe for you, since you haven't read any of the arguments, and it's not really wise for you to make a judgment about which of these theories is most reasonable without having read it. It's best to then say Homer composed, because that way you're not committing yourself to a particular point of view. If you say Homer wrote, you are, and you don't even know what the arguments are to support that particular point of view. So when you're dealing with something as controversial as did Homer write the Odyssey or Iliad, it's best to, in your case, take an agnostic position. And the way in which to express your agnostic position is to say Homer composed. You don't always have to know everything. We can always sit in a position of not knowing, waiting for a bit more information. And as you're doing that, it's best to say, in this case, Homer composed, until you can make a more informed decision. So that's my advice for how you're going to handle any writing about Homer, is to just go with Homer composed. That way your base is recovered and you're not getting into trouble with that. So now we're going to turn to the close readings. So I'm going to first begin with book 1 and the Maenus of Achilles, son of Peleus.
Okay, so first I want to begin with giving you guys a sense of what the poem sounded like through this reconstruction of the rhythm and reading there, just so you can get a sense of what the performance might have been like.
Meinina eide te a Pele I adeo Achilleos Ulla menein he nyri Achaios alge eteke Ballas diptimus tyukassa I dipra I absen Hero o nautuste heloria teuke kynesin Oio noisi te pasi De oste te leie to bule Ex ude ta prota di astete in erisante Atreides te wanaxandron kai dios Achilleus Tystars o te on eridix une eike makestai Le tuskai di osquios Agar basile I coloteis Lusona nastraton orse caceno le conto de la oi Une que ton crusen e timas en are terra Atreides hogar elte to ase pine asakaion Lusomenos te tugatra Peronta peresi apoina Stemma te konen kersin Hekebolo Apollonos Crusewa naskeptro Kai lisse to pantas akaius Atreidane malista duo cosmetorela on.
So that would be a fairly, I guess, reasonable reconstruction of the poem, and you can hear some of the rhythm, and I'm sure you could hear some of the little bit of a rhyme scheme kind of going on there. Now let's look at our close reading. And what I want to focus on is the first lines of the Iliad and how they shape how we are going to understand the whole poem, but in particular the two books we're looking at, Book 1 and Book 9. So in Greek epics, usually the first word or the first sentence, but particularly the first word, is extremely important. The beginning of the text is this auspicious moment, and so the first word carries a lot of thematic weight on the rest of the poem. And so in the Iliad, the first word is Manes, here given to us in the accusative Mainin. And so the goddess is being asked to sing the Manes of Peleus' son, Peleadao, Achilles. So what is this about? Well, so the subject of the Iliad is not the Trojan War, nor is it even Achilles himself, right? The subject of the Iliad is the Manes of Achilles. So then the question is, what is this Manes? Now, Fagles, in the translation that I asked you guys to look at, translates it as rage. And I would say he under-translates it as rage. Rage, we get the picture of Achilles as sort of throwing a temper tantrum, or expressing his personal outrage, or something like that, right? Rage doesn't really capture what Manes actually is. My preferred translation for this word is wrath, mainly because it has this unusualness of it. We don't talk about people's wrath unless we imagine catastrophic devastation as the result of the person acting it out, right? So wrath is a better translation, mainly because again, as I said, it's unique and it's not as common as rage. Anger is also an under translation, because anger again is a very common word, and Manes in the Greek text here is not very common. It only occurs in certain instances, and these instances are very, very important. Now, in antiquity, the scholars of Alexandria in the library debated what Manus meant, right? And why did they put it at the beginning of the poem? So modern scholars too, as I said, are just writing constantly about it. But the most insightful, I think, reading of this word or interpretation of this word is by Professor Leonard Mueller in his book, The Anger of Achilles. And it was published in 1996. Now, this text revolutionized, at least some people's understanding of anger, the wrath, the meanness, the rage, revolutionized our understanding because it was the first to seriously take account of the fact that the poem came into existence through oral composition, that is, in performance for an audience that would be listening and not reading, right? The tendencies of earlier, and even still today, other approaches have been to treat the text still, yeah, okay, we acknowledge that it was orally composed, but now we have a text and let's treat it as if it were a text. This is not really appropriate if we really want to get at the cultural significance of Manus. So, bearing in mind then that the poem results from centuries of refinement through performance and competitions, you have to approach it with that, the kind of techniques that go with that. So this is why I say that Fegel's translation, Rage, sort of under-translates Manus because it approaches it in the ways that don't fully acknowledge the oral nature of the text. As I said, my preferred word to translate Manus is wrath. And another reason why I think it's more appropriate than rage or anger is that wrath in English has associations with the gods. And indeed, Manus in the context of epic is something that is really belonging to gods. So it's not a hostile emotion that arises out of an individual against another individual, like anger or rage, but rather Manus is the implacable anger or hostility or rage of a god or goddess when he or she feels that his or her person has been offended, or his or her status in the divine human or divine to divine hierarchy has been threatened or abused. And then the Manus then is the expression of that feeling of anger and rage in the devastating consequences against the offender, but also against everyone associated with that person. So it's the targeting, once Manus is triggered, then it's a very imprecise targeting of the source of that rage. It sweeps up everyone in relation to the target. So we might consider it as sort of like a drone strike that takes out the whole village just to get the one terrorist. So this is Manus. Manus then takes everyone out, mainly because the kind of anger or the rage, because it's attacking the social hierarchy, the hierarchy of the person's status, the god's status and position in the social hierarchy, then it's triggered by revolt, or, as I said, threatening that god's position as its superior, and everyone around the target is assumed to be in solidarity with the offender. Even if they're not, doesn't matter. You're going to take them all out. And so Manes then is most closely in the Iliad, most closely associated with Zeus, but other gods and are connected to it. And Achilles is the sole mortal who the noun Manes is attached to. So that's important. The gods all can have Manes as the noun, but the only mortal who has Manes as a noun is Achilles. Meanwhile, in the verb form, to engage in Manes, right? This is used for the gods and other heroes, except Achilles. And most notably, it is used for Agamemnon. So Agamemnon engages in Manes in Book 1, and we'll see that shortly. So then the use of the verb for Agamemnon actually maps on to use of the noun for Zeus. And what it suggests then that they're just actually variants of the same usage. And what is at the core of the similarity is that they are both enforcing the hierarchy. They're enforcing the sovereign cosmic order of things. And this is really crucial. So now, it's not going to be surprising then that Manes is often going to trigger more Manes. You can just think about ordinary anger itself. When one person gets angry and lashes out, often another person gets angry and lashes back, and before you know it, you're in some kind of big brawl. Well, this is the same with Manes, that people can trigger other people's Manes, other gods' Manes, by acting out one's own Manes. So here, Hera is a good example where her Manes, it triggers Zeus's Manes. So her Manes can be triggered, or is often triggered, by Zeus's infidelity in their marriage. She's the goddess of marriage. He violates that by sleeping with other goddesses, and in particular heroines. So usually then her anger is triggered because it's not just that she's the jealous wife, but she's also the goddess of marriage. And so if her husband is not honoring marriage, marriage is under threat. Her whole domain as a goddess is under threat, and so she is going to retaliate in order to get things back to normal, to enforce the cosmic order of things. And so in the case of Zeus sleeping with Alcmene, the mother of Heracles, this triggered Hera's Manes, famously. And then she activates her Manes by causing Heracles to go crazy and to murder his entire family. So here we can see the sort of communal devastation that Manes produces. And then, of course, Zeus's response is more Manes. And Zeus, being stronger than her in every way and more powerful, he bound her hand and foot and hung her from Olympus until his Manes was satisfied. And he also ran after all the other gods and any ones he could catch, and he hurled them down from Olympus. So again, it's not just Hera who gets it, but everyone else around her. They're all assumed to be in solidarity with her. In Book 15 of the Iliad, we see a situation where Manes is sort of avoided. Ares' Manes is triggered by the death of his son Asclepius on the battlefield, and he really wants to act out in revenge, and he's really hard to. He's one of these people that can't control their anger anyway, and he wants to act out in revenge on the battlefield by slaughtering all the Greeks and Trojans indiscriminately, because he's the berserker god. But Athena intervenes and warns him that his Manus will trigger Zeus's Manus. And it's not a matter of just that, okay, you can be obliterated and you can suffer the penalty of that. But the problem is that all the other gods will also be targets of this Manus of Zeus. So there's this built-in idea that Manus is connected to sort of collective punishment. And Manus usually, it's righteous, tends to be righteous anger. Usually the person who's angry has a reason to be angry and they want to defend their honor, their person. But also it might trigger Manus from a more powerful being. So here Mueller lists some other examples, or the other examples of offenses that trigger Manus in the epics, both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we mentioned already that the not fulfilled Manus of Ares triggering Zeus's Manus could be, but here in book 5 we know that he does actually act out and he gets punished by Zeus. So disobedience is normally a trigger for Manus. So disobedience of gods to Zeus, not obeying the hierarchy of Zeus. Disobedience of mortal warriors to Apollo in this case, where Apollo tells them not to do something and then they go ahead and do it, and that triggers his Manus. And this is important because the reference here to book 16 is going to be what we're going to look at when we look at the death of Patroclus. Patroclus disobeys Zeus or Apollo and is destroyed because of the Manus there. You have what we're looking at here in book 1 is Achilles defying Agamemnon's authority, and that's going to trigger Agamemnon's Manus. Also, in other texts, the hymn to Demeter, we have the story of the Rape of Persephone. Well, the Rape of Persephone triggers the Manus of Demeter, her mother, and she acts out. And how she acts out is she punishes the gods by making the humans have no food. Like, she produces famine, and so then the humans can't sacrifice to the gods and they don't honor the gods. And so and until she relents, this is going to go on. So Zeus eventually is forced to come up with some kind of compromise for her. Leaving the dead unburied, which is an important theme in this text that we want to focus on. This is going to trigger Manus. So not properly treating the dead will trigger the Manus of the gods. Desecrating a sacrifice, obviously, is going to trigger the Manus of the gods. Leaving a god or goddess out of the sacrifice to all the gods, likely to anger that god and trigger Manus. Violating certain social rules of hospitality, of how to treat beggars, what to do with ransom, what to do with prize distributions. These can trigger Manus. And here, in the case of the prize distribution, the issue, and the ransom, these are the two that are first appear in our text that we're going to look at, how Manus is then triggered that way. All right, so armed with our understanding of Manus, that Manus is the anger that is triggered by violating the person's integrity, their status, and also the devastating consequences that comes from that, and that it's closely associated with the wrath of gods, right? Then we can come back to what's going on in our story. So Goddess is being asked to sing the Manus of Achilles. So Achilles' devastating anger, this is sense of his integrity being offended, right? We already know this, that it's going to be about him feeling that his status his honor, etc., has been threatened just in Manus already. So she's going to sing this. And it's interesting that he is also introduced as the son of Peleus. So it's the wrath of Achilles, son of Peleus. Now this matters because the story behind how he is the son of Peleus is connected to the Trojan War, because his mother is a goddess, the sea goddess Thetis. And when Zeus was trying to collect a lot of the goddesses as his concubines, Thetis was one of the ones he was interested in. She, however, had a prophecy that said she would produce a son that was more powerful than his father. So this meant she was off limits. But she's not only off limits to Zeus, but off limits to all the other male gods, because if she produced a son that was stronger than his father, it would definitely pose a threat to Zeus's stability in his regime. And so Zeus then passed divine legislation saying that no god could marry Thetis. Now, of course, Thetis is going to be upset about this. And so the solution they came up with was then that Hera would arrange for Thetis to marry Achilles' father, Peleus, who was a hero, the best hero of the era, and that they would sanction the marriage. Because you'll remember in our list of things that can trigger Manus from the gods is mortals sleeping with goddesses or gods, right? And so here, this is going to be sanctioned, a sanctioned marriage, one of the few sanctioned marriages in Greek mythology where the gods all attend the wedding, etc. Now, you'll remember that, or maybe you're not familiar, but if you are familiar, you might remember that it's at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis that the goddess of discord, problematic figure who you probably wouldn't want to invite to your wedding anyway, she gets disinvited or not invited, and in her anger, her Manus, she throws in the famous apple of discord, the golden apple, and on it is written, "To the fairest to cause trouble." And then the goddesses, of course, start fighting over it. The goddesses being Hera, the queen, bearing in mind that this is an apple that actually belongs to her. But Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena, these are the three goddesses that claim the apple. And Zeus, of course, says hands off. He's not going to make the judgment, and he decides to pawn the judgment off onto Paris, the son of the Trojan king Priam, right? And Paris, of course, is seduced by Aphrodite, offered Helen, the queen of Sparta, as his prize if he picks her, and he, of course, does. He picks Aphrodite. He picks Aphrodite as the one who should get the apple, and he's then given Helen. Aphrodite, of course, forgot to mention that Helen was already married, and so when he actually goes to get her, they sneak off in the dead of the night, and they come to Troy. Now, this, of course, happened 20 years ago. Okay. But it's lurking there in the background. This is the cause of the Trojan War, right? That Helen ran off with Paris to Troy, and then Agamemnon and Menelaus, her husband Menelaus, gather an army and come and sack Troy. This is a pretext for the sack of Troy. All right, so all of that is packed into the reference to Peleus here. So, and also packed into it is the reminder that Achilles was not Zeus's son. So he could have been, but he was not, right? And so there's also built-in resentment in Thetis that she was forced to marry a mortal, marry down, right? Marry against her status. So she's angry in the text. We'll see. When we meet her, she's not a happy camper. And she has been transmitting her anger to Achilles in how she talks about her relationship to Zeus. And we'll see that she tells Achilles that she was someone who helped Zeus fend off attempts to overthrow his government, which is true. She did in marrying Peleus. But the way it's presented to Achilles is as if she was some kind of warrior helper goddess that helped him overthrow this attack of the other gods on him. So that's the story Achilles is grown up listening to about his mother's relationship with Zeus. Well, we'll see when Thetis actually interacts with Zeus, it's more about her sexual wiles, about her sexual appeal to him that gets Achilles what he wants. It's not her "you owe me, Zeus," for back in the day when you were in trouble and I helped you. But no, it's I'm attractive, and using her, playing the pretty card to get what she wants. All right, so that's all built into Peleus. All right, and then, so this wrath of Achilles is said to be oulamenein. And it's important that, again, we not fall into the trap that Peleus falls into in translating it as murderous, because, again, he's under-translating the meaning, right? The wrath of Achilles is this. Oulamenein means devastating destruction, catastrophic destruction. So murderous doesn't quite cut it here. And so this kind of meanness is casting the heroes into Hades, right? And leaving their bodies on the battlefield for dogs and birds to eat. Now remember, in our list of things that cause meanness is leaving bodies unburied, and especially if dogs and birds violate those bodies, right? So that is another cause of meanness. So his meanness, his destructive meanness, is causing the meanness, more meanness, right? We talked about meanness can trigger more meanness. Here's a case where, yes, his meanness, his destructive meanness, is going to trigger even more meanness, right? But nevertheless, in this meanness causing more meanness, Zeus's will is being fulfilled. So the question then is, what is Zeus's will? Can it be just to support Achilles' anger at Agamemnon? Or is there more to it? And I would suggest that there is a lot more to it. Again, this Dios boule is a phrase that the readers, or the hearers, actually, the audience of the original text in performance would have recognized as a phrase that shows up in other stories to do with the Trojan War or even the Theban Wars, is that the Zeus' will is his decision that we are going to wipe out the race of heroes because they are rebellious against the gods. Some of them are, of course, children of the gods, so some gods love some of the heroes, but other gods see the children of other gods as rebellious toward them, and they trigger meanness, and they have wiped them out. So there's constant heroes being wiped out because they offend gods, and then this, of course, causes trouble, pain, and suffering with the gods themselves, and the gods just want to stop all of that. And the best solution they come up with is just, let's genocide the heroes. We'll just wipe them off the face of the earth. This is what the will of Zeus is, and it's important to understand that as we are reading the Iliad, that the will of Zeus is to wipe out the race of heroes, so that to extend the gap between the gods and mortals. because right now the heroes are in the intermediary stage and they tend to act out as if they are gods. So what we want is a clearer line of division between the race of gods and the race of mortals, right? And so this is the Dios Boule that Achilles' Manus, his wrath, fits into, right? So his wrath that's going to generate a lot of dead is actually part and parcel of the larger wrath of Zeus, which is to wipe out all of the heroes. Okay. All right. So then who set them, the two, into quarreling, right? And we already know it's the verbal form here, and these two words here that say standing apart in strife. The forms of the verbs in them are dual. So we know before we get the names that it's two heroes that are quarreling, and we know from the Odyssey that there were other quarrels that different heroes had with Achilles. So in the Odyssey, it's the quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, and here it's going to be we're told, when we get to that part of the story, we're wondering, which one is it? Is it going to be Achilles and Odysseus, or some other person on Odysseus? Well, we're told it's Atreides to Anaxandron kai Dios Achilles. So it's the son of Atreus, Atreides, and the king of men. So this is really emphasized, his position as the Lord of men. He is the top dog in this whole operation, like Zeus among the gods. Atreides is the Lord among mortals, right? And Dios Achilles. Achilles the godlike, not a son of the god, godlike. Okay, so that is who the quarrel is going to be with. So again, Atreides, just like Pleiades indicates the father, Peleus' son, it has a whole lot of stories brought up by that. So Atreides brings up a lot of stories that sort of fill out, that the audience would have been able to fill out, that, well, there is a curse on the sons of Atreus, right? Or that Atreus and his brother had a curse on them, and that his father cursed that. Like there's a whole system of Manus coming down on the sons of Atreus here. And why? Well, if we just go to the previous generation with Atreus himself and his brother Thyestes, well, Atreus's brother Thyestes raped Atreus's wife, and Atreus, needless to say, had Manus, and his response to that was to take all of Atreus's sons and kill them, chop them up, cook them, and serve them as a meal to his brother. And of course, that, needless to say, is something that would trigger divine Manus, anger from the gods, because again, cannibalism is not really recognized. Forced cannibalism even more so, and of course the way he treated his family members is not good at all. So all of this has on Atreus and Thyestes for raping his brother's wife. So they have Manus to be worked out through them in their children. All right. And so we have these two situations going on. Achilles is working out, or he's sort of been brought up under the Manus of his mother, this unfulfilled Manus of his mother, because she can't really buck the system of Zeus and the gods, and also the sort of imminent Manus that is coming down on Agamemnon and his brother from the fact that they are sons of Atreus. Okay. And then, well, who put them together? Who is the god that brought them together into this fight? Well, we're told that it is Latus kai Dios Vios. Important. Letos and Zeus's son. Really important here. Again, remember, Thetis was supposed to be a concubine of Zeus, but she had this prophecy and that made her ineligible. Whereas Leto did not have such a prophecy, and so she is one of the chief concubines of Zeus, and her son is Apollo. And so we see here an opposition already set up in the beginning of the poem between Apollo and Achilles. And if you know anything about the actual outcome of Achilles' life, he's killed by none other than Apollo, right? And so Apollo is the god that is going to take Achilles out. And in fact, the two are worshipped together as part of the divine antagonism cult. So there's, as I said, the gods are angry at specific heroes, and then they take them out, and the taking out of that hero brings glory to the god, and so they're worshipped together. But really a clear example of this is Hera and Heracles. Even his name, the glory of Hera. Yeah, her taking him out is the glory for her. So similarly, then Apollo is worshipped with Achilles, and because Achilles also is the one that took him out. We think Orpheus is worshipped with Dionysus because Dionysus took him out. Okay, and so that is the god that is. He and Achilles are tied together in this ritual divine antagonism. But here, the reason why Apollo sets these two against each other is because of his anger at the king, not at Achilles, but at Agamemnon. And his anger at Agamemnon is manifested in his sending of a plague into the army. And the plague is destroying the ordinary soldiers, the laoi. Right? The soldiers are dying. And well, why did Apollo get angry? Well, he got angry because Agamemnon, the son of Atreides, did not honor his priest, i.e., he was again being offensive to the god, right? It says here, because when the priest Chryses came, he didn't honor him, and even though he came with the signs that he was the priest of Apollo, he was the stemata, these fillets, the ribbons that show that he's the priest of Apollo. Agamemnon didn't honor him, and he's a priest of a specific type of Apollo Hekebolos, the far shooter. Fagels translates distant deadly archer, right? Again, calling in Apollo who punishes with disease, as Apollo is wont to do for those who offend him. So he's showing up with, hey, I'm the priest of Apollo, the one who can devastate your whole army here, and you are gonna dishonor me. And so what does he do? The priest then goes off and prays to Apollo to punish the king. Okay, so now let's look closely at what the priest is actually asking Agamemnon to do, and how he words it, and how this sort of sets up the problem that Agamemnon is going to, the trouble he's going to get into. So he comes to Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus, and says, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all the Argives geared for war, may the gods who hold the halls of Olympus give you Priam's city to plunder, and then safe passage home. So this is like, let this whole thing turn out well. Let you win the war, let you sack the city, and let you get home safely. Of course, it's not what's going to happen to most of them, but that's what he's praying for, and that this is something that should be on their minds. And then he says, Paidamoi lusai te philein te appoina de gestai, which Fagels translates as, set my daughter free, my dear one, here accept these gifts, this ransom. Here again, it's a bit undertranslated. He's saying, he refers to his daughter as Paida. This is important. He's pointing out that she is a child. And I want you to let that sink in. She is a child. That means she's under the age that's appropriate for marriage. And given that the age for marriage was something like 12, 13, we're talking about a child. Okay? This is important. And he's saying, let me ransom my dear child, my 8-year-old, say, and receive this ransom, this countless ransom. So this is a father's assessment in a culture that does assess people value. The father's assessment of the value of his child daughter, and he said, and we're told that it's boundless, countless ransom, and he's made that assessment. And he says also, honor, in taking my ransom, you will be honoring the son of Zeus, Dios Wion, Hekebolon Apollon. So the full authority of Apollo is here. He is Zeus's son, and he's also the one who shoots from far. Now it's worth paying attention to, what is the response of the rest of the army to this request? Well, they say, respect the priest, accept the shining ransom, right? They think it's the right thing to do. And I think it really needs to be stressed that, yeah, he probably should give her back, not just because it's the god priest that's asking, but also, as I said, she is a child, right? And so what does he plan to do with this child, right? And that's the worry that the father has, of course. He's coming with the knowledge that women and children are abused in these kinds of situations. When your city is sacked, and your women and children have been carried off, they're going to be enslaved, they're going to be raped, they're going to be abused. So here he is giving as much as he can to get his daughter back, protect her out of this situation. He's doing his job as a father. He's not a warrior, he's a priest, so he's emphasizing the fact that his connection to the god Apollo is what he has to protect his family with. And the army says, yes, respect the priest, accept the shining ransom. Seems reasonable to them. But we're told it brought no joy to the heart of Agamemnon. The king dismissed the priest in a brutal order with ringing in his ears. And he says, never again, old man, let me catch sight of you by the hollow ships. Not loitering now, not slinking back tomorrow. The staff and the reeds of the gods shall never save them, or shall never save you then. The girl, I won't give up the girl. Long before that, old age will overtake her in my house. in Argos, far from her homeland, slaving back and forth at the loom, and forced to share my bed. Now here, Fagles hasn't under-translated or over-translated. He actually does a perfect job in the translation. And so you can imagine the terror that the priest has here. But also, you can see the triggering of menace here, right? That this is an instance, a kind of action, kind of crime that will trigger menace. That is the thought of having your daughter not only enslaved and working the loom, as he said, but also forced to serve his bed. So this, but of course it's an impotent menace for the priest because he is not as powerful as Agamemnon. And so he has to rely on his connection to the god Apollo. So the response then of the priest is to go to Apollo, right? And to pray to the god. And he says, "Hear me, Apollo, god of the silver bow, who strides the walls of Chrysae, which is his city, and Scylla, sacrosanct." These are his places. Lord in power of Tenedos, Smintheus, god of plague. Right? If I ever roofed a shrine to please your heart, I ever burned the long rich thigh bones of bulls and goats on your holy altar, now bring my prayer to pass. Pay the Danaans back your arrows for my tears. So here he's reminding the god that I have always honored you. I have built your temples. I've done all the things. I'm a righteous person. And here I've encountered someone who is utterly disrespecting you, and I want you to punish them. So my menace for what's happening, I can't carry it out. But you, God, Apollo, you carry it out for me. And so there's asking the god to sanction his menace, to basically amp it up, bolster it, and give it the power that it needs to overcome the menace of Agamemnon. Because obviously Agamemnon's angry response is at the perceived insult of being asked to do anything by someone who's inferior to him, someone whose city he's just sacked or his men have just sacked and whose daughter is enslaved to him. Who are you to come and talk to me about anything? That's Agamemnon's attitude. And he is much more powerful than Chryses. So Chryses needs to get the backing of the god who's more powerful to get his menace satisfied. And of course, in not receiving the priest, in fact, in kicking him and mistreating him, while he is of course dressed in all of the regalia of the god, and disrespecting him by not accepting the ransom, Apollo is willing to listen to the prayer of his priest. And it says that the priest's prayer went up, and Phoebus Apollo heard him. Down he strode from Olympus' peak, storming at the heart with his bow. So again, he's angry. He's ready with menace, or at least anger here. And with his bow and his hooded quiver slung across his shoulders, the arrows clanged on his back as the god quaked with rage. And the god himself on the march, down he came like night. Over against the ships, he dropped on his knee and he let fly a shaft, and the terrifying clang out from the silver bow. And first he went for the mules and the circling dogs, but then, launching a piercing shaft at the men themselves, he cut them down in droves, and the corpse fires burned on night and day, and no end in sight. So yeah, the idea Then he starts off with the animals, so sort of like, trans-species plague. It goes from mules to dogs to people, and nothing they can do but just bury the dead, burn the dead. And this keeps going on. They're losing their force, their military force, in the process. It's interesting that it takes a while before anyone thinks of confronting Agamemnon with the fact that he is responsible for the plague. It's Achilles who comes up with that idea and suggests that they consult a seer. Agamemnon, of course, wouldn't come up with this idea on his own. Perhaps he's feeling guilty already, but he's not going to go to a seer because he actually has a history with seers. Go back to before they actually arrived in Troy, he had trouble getting across the sea because the winds were opposite to them. And when he consulted the seer, same seer, Calchas pointed out that, well, it's because Agamemnon had offended Artemis, sister of Apollo, by killing one of her sacred deer, and now she demands a sacrifice, his daughter, as a sacrifice in order to appease the winds. And in that story, Agamemnon chooses his goal of sacking Troy over his connection to his family. And needless to say, that is going to generate Maenus in his wife Clytemnestra, who is quite angry at the fact that he was willing to kill his daughter for this mission. So now here again, Calchas tells him that he is the cause of the plague. It's not unlikely that everybody else also saw that. And of course, his reaction is to complain about the seer. He says, "Seer of misery, never a word that works to my advantage. You're always coming up with stuff to make me look bad." Right? And then he now tries to justify why he wanted to keep the girl. He's not explaining away why he insulted Apollo and Apollo's seer, but he's trying to explain, sort of justify why he wanted to keep the girl. And he claims that, well, I prefer her to my wife Clytemnestra, and he was planning on marrying her. Now he's sort of mitigating whatever the crime was from child rape, all the things he threatened to her father. Now it's like, well, no, I really wanted to marry her, presumably make her my queen, replace Clytemnestra with her, and that's what's really going on. And somehow that's supposed to make everybody feel better that there's a plague going on. But anyways, he says he's willing to give her back. Just trying to save face, he's willing to give her back. And what I really want is to keep my people safe and not to see them dying. And this seems to be a genuine statement of his. But fetch me another prize, straight off too, else I alone of the Argives will go home. That would be a disgrace. So he can't be without a comfort woman. That would be a disgrace. And so, look, and he's saying, look, witness it, my prize is being snatched away. So he associates his position as king among the heroes as it has to be given his prize. He has to have a woman to sleep with, despite the fact that his unwillingness to give up his initial prize caused the plague. Now, when Achilles objects to this and saying that, no, you can't do that. We can't redistribute all the prizes again. You have to just wait until later, and when we distribute everything again, you can get a new prize. Agamemnon again reacts with outraged that this is not possible, and then threatens to take someone else's prize away. Now, initially, it's not Achilles' prize that he is going to take, right? Initially, he says, I will take the prize of any one of you guys, Odysseus, Idomeneus, etc. But then Achilles keeps pressing the point that, no, you can't do this. And then this makes Agamemnon wheel on him and say, you know what? It's going to be your prize. And at that point, Achilles gets so enraged that his prize is going to be taken. This is when his Manus is now triggered, and he is about to kill Agamemnon. He reaches for his sword and is about to just rush him through, but he's contemplating whether he should just stuff down his anger or whether he should just stab him right there. And the goddesses Hera and Athena intervene. Hera sends Athena down there to check Achilles. She grabs him by the hair and tells him to calm down, that this is not appropriate. Because, again, if he were to do that, this would be an outrageous act of insubordination, right? And he would be subject to Manus. Perhaps all of the heroes might take offense to him. But he's sort of putting himself in harm's way if he were to do that. So this brings us back to the question of, like, well, why did Apollo set them against each other? Well, he was offended at the king, the king Agamemnon, for offending his honor by dissing his priest. But in the process, he also triggers Achilles' anger. And so now the two are standing apart from each other. And Achilles says he's leaving, and a lot of curses in between, and Achilles storms off. And in the story, then he goes to his mother, begging her to get Zeus to back his claims. And so just as the priest prayed to Apollo to back up his anger and his desire for revenge and wanting help to get his daughter back, now Achilles is going to his mother and asking his mother to go to Zeus, who he thinks owes her something, and getting Zeus to back up his Manus against Agamemnon. And the consequence of Zeus, because he does kind of owe Thetis something, because of course she complains that she's been dishonored, but she's also using her sexual wiles. The consequence of Zeus saying yes, he's going to grant her what she wants, that is to support her son's Manus, then the consequence is that the Greeks start to lose the war. And that is what starts the ball rolling. Now, we'll turn to the next book that you guys were supposed to look at. In book 9, we have the embassy of the Greeks to Achilles. Now, this is kind of like the scene where Calchas confronts Agamemnon with the fact that he is responsible for the plague. Again, Agamemnon is recognizing that, well, he is responsible for the deaths that are happening because of Achilles' absence. So he then sends envoys to Achilles to try to get him to come back to war. Now, the envoys to Achilles have a dilemma. They have to present Agamemnon's gifts in a way that honors Achilles without shaming Agamemnon. And now, even though Agamemnon's tribute is, over the top, blame can't be attributed to him. And this is because he continues to insist upon his own superiority among the heroes. So Odysseus then is the first to speak, and he outlines the value of the gifts in terms of how much they're worth. And Achilles, of course, is not happy with this and reminds his friends of his two fates, right? Premature death, that is, he can either stay here and fight and die young with glory, or long life in obscurity. So if he takes these gifts, how will that matter if he dies here in Troy, right? Because he continues to fight, he will die. So Phoenix then is the next one in the relay to take up the torch and try to convince Achilles. And he understands him a little bit better because he's his adopted son, and he knows that he's not likely to let go of an argument, etc. He's got a stubborn personality. So Phoenix then tells him 3 stories, and I'm going to focus on the one that's the autobiography, and then the story about the Caledonian War Hunt. And the problem is that these stories don't get the result. Achilles is still not brought around to Agamemnon's point of view. So, but nevertheless, it's worth looking at what they are, because they tell us a little bit about, again, this theme of anger and how it's operating here. And I have a suggestion as to how or why they fail, which has to do with how Achilles sees himself in these stories. So let's start with the first one, which is Phoenix's autobiography, where he tells how, his life, how he got into trouble. So he is Achilles' foster father, like he's put under the care of Achilles. Achilles is put under his care by his father Peleus while he's at war. So Phoenix tells that his own father, Amintor, had a slave as his concubine. And this, of course, enraged Phoenix's mother. And so she then comes to Phoenix, and who suggests to him that he sleep with the slave girl himself. And that way the slave girl will prefer him to the old father, and that will get her revenge out. So father sleeping with slave girl generates anger. Mother doesn't have the wherewithal to accomplish her revenge, so she enlists her son, and he's going to do that. But of course, this is going to generate further anger. So Amintor then, when he finds out what's happening, he then curses Phoenix that he's never going to have any sons. And the gods actually fulfill this. So the gods back up Amintor's curse, because of course, why? Phoenix has disturbed the cosmic order by going against his father, threatening his father's authority. Right? So in this anger, when he hears this curse, Phoenix intends to kill his own father, right? But he checked his anger. And then he decides instead to abandon his home to avoid the blood feud. And then his friends guess his intent, and they take care of him for 9 days, hoping that his fury is going to cool down. But then on the 10th day, Phoenix escapes and arrives in Phthia, where Peleus welcomes him and then makes him the tutor and then the sort of mentor of Achilles. So apparently Peleus is super generous. He enriches Phoenix with wealth and makes him a lord in his domain. So now, then this conflict then with Phoenix and his father can be simulated or likened to the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon. Many scholars have observed this. And this position derives from some obvious parallels, right? That there's an argument over a concubine. Phoenix is urged to kill the father. The rage is then sort of stopped by a god. And then the self-imposed withdrawal. All these things sort of map on to what's happening in the Iliad. Now, there's also the likelihood that he himself, Phoenix, may have had his own motivations for sleeping with his father's concubine, not the least being a sort of will to challenge his father's authority. He perhaps didn't need his mother to, maybe his mother saw that he was wanting to challenge his father's authority. He gave him this particular opportunity that served her interests. Anyways, the deed certainly expresses this deep-seated rivalry or willingness to challenge his father's authority, and no doubt explains why Amintor then reacts the way he does with this curse. So similarly, we can see that Achilles when he's confronting Chryses, he's already got an axe to grind against Agamemnon. It's not this instance of he's already angry before Agamemnon even threatens to take Briseis away. He's seeing Agamemnon as someone who needs to be taken down a peg, mainly because he himself is not being honored to the way he thinks he should be honored. And so he's looking for, he's probably on the lookout already for an opportunity to humiliate Agamemnon. And of course the Chryses situation opens itself. It's not an accident that he is the one that suggests that Calchas be consulted, and then he supports Calchas in his speaking. So the seizure of Briseis then follows. Remember, again, Agamemnon didn't necessarily pick on Achilles as taking his girl, but it's because Achilles kept goading him why he did. And so there's a lot of parallels here. So that let us see that there's already this pre-existing anger, seething anger in Achilles that the story of Phoenix sort of suggests. Now, Phoenix's story then is a palliative. Like, it's meant to make Achilles' situation try to see that, wait, there's culpability on both sides, and maybe you guys could patch it up and then accept the gifts. I mean, after all, Agamemnon, yeah, sure, he was selfish, but you, Achilles, should accept the authority of the king in this way. Now, and he shouldn't endanger the other Greeks. So, but of course, Achilles doesn't buy this particular story, and he just rejects that. Phoenix's last story that he tells Achilles is about the Caledonian War Hunt, which happened the generation before. It's in the generation of Achilles' father, with the heroes of that generation that are the Argonauts or the Caledonian Boar Hunters, Hercules. These are all that generation of heroes. And they are supposed to be, the legendary great men of the past, right? And so Phoenix figures, okay, let me tell him a story about that sort of parallels his own life. And so he tells a story of how Meleager was fighting in this attempt to take down the boar. He describes how Meleager's father, Oeneus, failed to offer the first fruits of his vineyards and orchards to Artemis, creating Maenus. She then retaliated by sending this gigantic boar to uproot all their crops and just ravage the countryside, killing a lot of people and just causing a lot of trouble. And so then the Aetolians, who are being led by Meleager and their allies, get together and try to take it down, and they eventually do, and they kill it. Now then they start fighting over the division of the spoils after the war, and the Curetes then declare war on the Aetolians, and laying siege to the capital Caledon. Meleager then has some great successes in the war until one of his maternal uncles is killed. It's one of his relatives. And they blame Meleager for this death. That is, his mother blames Meleager for this death, and she curses him. And he withdraws to his bedchamber and withdraws from battle and stays with his wife Cleopatra. Now, and he refuses to fight, and even when they come with generous gifts and promises, he refuses. So the elders, the priests, his own father, Oeneus, his sisters, his mother, and his great friends all come in order to beg him to act, to fail. So the only then is that the wife Cleopatra, she's begging him, and what she does is she points out, look, the women are going to be sold into slavery, and the children as well, and she makes this stirring plea to him that he finally decides, okay, he's going to commit himself back to the war. And then he ultimately saves Caledon, but by the time he rescues the city, the offer to compensate him has been withdrawn. They're like, you took too damn long to get yourself back here. So now this story was then, even in antiquity, was seen as clearly a parallel for what's going on in the Iliad, and Achilles is meant to see himself in Meleager. However, Achilles doesn't respond in the expected way. He doesn't see himself as Meleager in this story. Rather, he sees himself, I would argue, as Artemis, who is angry at the Aetolians and is only satisfied when she feels she's satisfied. And so her anger, the appeasing of her anger, is decided by her and not by external circumstances. This is Achilles' position. And so when he hears this story, he doesn't really recognize Meleager, partly because, of course, he thinks of himself as superior to his father. Meleager is one of the heroes of his father's generation, so he doesn't really see any reason to identify with those heroes. So, and in the end, then the embassy fails. So, in our discussion, I want you to think about the questions that you've been posed with. Why does he fail, etc.? Why can't they convince him? What is up here? Okay, so we will see you in the discussion period next. Have a great afternoon.